The briefing document was 43 pages long, and by page 9, I already knew that no one was going to get this accord signed. Not because the SciFi delegation was unreasonable, not because the compact's terms were unfair. The problem was simpler and more embarrassing than either of those things. Every representative the compact had stationed at Threshketh 11 in the past 11 days had found a reason, a very urgent, very plausible reason, to conduct all of their diplomatic contact through the way station's internal communication screens, rather than walking down the restricted corridor to actually speak with anyone. I sat in the small logistics office they had assigned me, read the 43 pages twice, and then set the briefing aside and looked at the notes my predecessor had filed before requesting reassignment. Day 1, SciFi delegation arrived, assigned to Wing C restricted access. Initial contact attempted via screen, no response. Day 2, screen contact attempted again, no response. Delegation observed moving freely within Wing C Commons, have confirmed they are not in distress. Request permission to attempt audio-only contact. Day 3, audio-only contact attempted. SciFi senior emissary responded briefly, stated that the SciFi Accord requires in-person representation. Requested clarification on when a representative would present themselves in Wing C directly. Response pending. The notes continued in this fashion for 8 more days. The phrase, response pending, appeared 11 times. My predecessor had been a capable diplomat with 17 years of outer posting experience, and she had apparently spent 11 days composing increasingly detailed memos about why direct contact with the SciFi delegation remained logistically challenging. I put the notes down. The reason, of course, was not logistics. I had seen the SciFi females once, briefly, years ago at a border trade summit, 2 of them, standing near the fuel exchange platform, talking to each other in the low-frequency register that their species used for private conversation. 7 feet tall, battle-scarred. Eyes that caught light in a way that no human eye does, silver gold and very still, with a faint luminous ring at the iris that didn't bioluminesce exactly, but something close. Every person within 40 meters had unconsciously adjusted their walking route to put more distance between themselves and that platform. Including me. That had been 12 years ago. I was 46 now. I had spent 20 years in outer posting liaisons, and I had been in enough rooms with enough species to know the difference between a threat and a thing that looked like a threat. I had also been in enough stalled negotiations to know what happened when everyone in the room was too proud to admit they were simply afraid. I closed the briefing folder. I checked the Waystation Commons schedule to see when Wing C's food service ran. Then I went to find out if the ground seed concentrate dispenser on the restricted wing produced anything worth drinking. It did. I carried 2 cups down the corridor at 7 in the morning, knocked on the Commons door the way you knock on a door when you have brought something warm and don't want it to go cold, and waited. The door opened. She was taller than I had remembered. Not surprising, at the border summit 12 years ago I had been 40 meters away and moving steadily in the opposite direction. Up close, the scale of her was different, not threatening in the way the briefing notes kept implying, just large in the way old trees are large and still. Her skin was the color of deep slate under the Waystation's corridor lighting, a blue-gray so deep it was nearly charcoal except where the overhead lights caught the faint grain of it, like stone with mineral running through. She was dressed in what the cultural briefing had described as standard SciFi working attire for non-combat postings, a layered garment in matte dark gray, functional, unornamented, built for a frame designed for efficiency rather than display. Her hair was close-cropped and dark. The eyes were exactly as I remembered, silver gold, very pale, with a faint luminous ring at the iris edge that shifted quality, not brightness, quality, when her attention shifted. They looked at me the way a good navigator looks at an instrument panel, gathering data, not yet reaching conclusions. I held up both cups. Ground seed concentrate, I said. The dispenser in Wing C produces the same blend as the main commons. I brought one standard steep and one secondary, longer extraction, more bitter register. I wasn't certain of your preference, so I brought both. If neither is right, I can go back. A pause, not hostile. More the pause of someone recalibrating against a different outcome than the one they had formed across 11 days of screens and intercoms. Standard, she said. I handed it over. She held it the way I had read about but not yet seen up close, full palms wrapped around the container, not fingertips. She looked at the cup for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door in the way that means you may come in if you want, which in most species I had worked with is polite enough. I came in. The Wing C Commons was a standard waystation configuration. 2 low tables, bench seating in dark station gray, a narrow viewport window set into the outer wall at approximately shoulder height. Through it, the secondary docking ring made its slow rotation, cargo shuttles and transit vessels moving in their scheduled arcs. There were 2 other Velsathi females in the room. One was seated at the far table with what appeared to be a transit manifest, reading it with the close attention of someone verifying figures rather than reading for content. The other was standing near the viewport window. Both of them looked at me the same way the emissary at the door had, that careful, instrument panel attention, taking in data, making no immediate judgment from it. I sat down at the nearer table. This is, I have found, more important than most people realize. If you enter a room and remain standing, you are a visitor who has not decided to stay. If you sit down, you have decided the room is worth staying in. It signals that you expect to be here for a while, that you are not about to leave at the first unexpected sound, that you have assessed the space and found it acceptable. The cultural briefing's 3 useful pages, out of 43, noted that Velsathi females distinguish between individuals who stand in doorways and individuals who come in and sit down. They find the second category more comprehensible. Solon Edar, I said. Compact Cultural Liaison, Grade 2. I arrived at Threshketh 11 yesterday afternoon. I apologize that it took 11 days for someone to walk down this corridor. The emissary sat across from me. She wrapped both hands around her cup and regarded me with that even attention. Kithra, she said, senior emissary of the Velsathi Accord delegation. Is there a family designation I should use? Velsorn, but Kithra is sufficient in a working context. Thank you, I picked up my own cup. Standard was the right call, clean, not harsh. I read the Accord terms last night. They appear straightforward. I don't understand why the signing session has been delayed 11 days. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, very precisely, your predecessors found our presence alarming. Yes, I said, I imagine they did. You do not. I thought about how to answer that honestly. I find you large, I said. That's a measurement, not a threat assessment. I've worked with larger species. Size isn't the part that matters. What I noticed when I read 11 days of status reports is that every contact attempt has been made through a screen or an intercom. Nobody has come to Wing C. You have been in this restricted corridor for 11 days, and the primary difficulty being cited is that direct contact remains logistically challenging. I set my cup down. That is not a logistics problem. It is a fear problem, and fear problems don't resolve through additional memos. Kithra held her cup with both palms and looked at me. What resolves them, she said. Someone walks down the corridor, I said. Usually that's enough. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, a cargo carrier completed its approach path and locked onto a docking arm. What is the secondary steep, she said. Longer extraction time. Draws out more of the compound's bitter soluble elements. Some species find it more complex, others find it unpleasant. I prefer standard. I'll remember that. That was the first morning. I want to be precise about what happened over the following 6 days, because I have told this story in various professional contexts since, and the version people prefer to hear is more dramatic than the one that actually occurred. The version people prefer involves a confrontation, a guard posted to bar my way, or a superior officer threatening disciplinary action, or some moment where the SciFi delegation demonstrated something that forced the fear narrative to collapse in front of witnesses. None of those things happened. What happened was quieter. I came to Wing C Commons every morning at 7 with 2 cups. On the second morning, Keithra had already poured her own and had a third cup waiting on the table when I came through the door. This, I learned later, is a SciFi gesture that means, I calculated when you would arrive, and I believe you will arrive again tomorrow. It is not a small gesture in their cultural vocabulary. At the time, I simply said thank you and sat down. The second SciFi female was introduced on the second morning. Her name was Veth. She was the delegation's logistics coordinator, and she was, if anything, more precise than Keithra. Her questions had a systematic quality, moving through a subject the way a proper survey moves through a grid, nothing skipped, nothing assumed. She asked me 19 questions about the compact's tariff structure in approximately 40 minutes. I answered all 19. She wrote the answers down in a notation system that used marks I didn't recognize, but which was clearly organized to a high standard of internal consistency, hierarchical symbols, cross-reference marks at the margins, a visual density that suggested she had developed the system herself rather than inherited it. You take notes, I said, when she set the notation tool down briefly. We all take notes, Veth said, in the tone of someone who finds the observation mildly self-evident. I mean during conversations, as they happen. Of course, memory is not a recording, memory is selective, notes correct for the selection. She looked at me across the table. You do not take notes. I find that people talk more freely if I'm not writing things down while they speak. Veth considered this the way she considered everything, not dismissively, but with the attention of someone genuinely evaluating a methodology that differs from their own. A different method, she said, in the tone of someone acknowledging a difference without rendering judgment on it. Then she continued with question 20. On the third morning, I began taking notes, not during conversations after. While the session was running, I listened and attended. When I returned to my assigned office, I wrote down what had been said as accurately as I could reconstruct it. By the fourth morning, I was doing this during sessions as well, not in a way that interrupted the conversation, but the way a person does when they want their interlocutor to see that what is being said is being preserved. On the fourth morning, I noticed Veth looking at my notation materials. She did not comment. But on the fifth morning, she positioned herself slightly closer to my side of the table, and I could tell she was reading what I wrote as I wrote it, checking it against what she had in her own notation materials, verifying the accuracy. She never said anything about it. On the third morning, I also had my first real conversation with the third SciFi female. Her name was Seath. She was the youngest of the 3 delegation members, 31, Keithra mentioned, which in SciFi terms meant she had completed her first major posting cycle and was early in her second. She had not been present for the first 2 mornings in the Commons. I had seen her briefly through the interior doorway on the first day, watching, but she had not come in. On the third morning, she sat at the far end of the bench with her hands in her lap and said nothing for approximately 40 minutes. I did not address her directly. I had learned not from the briefing, but from general practice across 20 years, that there is a category of person who is listening to everything and participating fully and simply not speaking yet, and that the worst thing you can do for them is invite them into a conversation before they have decided they are ready to enter it. The invitation, offered too early, signals that you have noticed their silence and found it uncomfortable. It turns their stillness into a problem that needs to be resolved on your timeline rather than theirs. I had seen enough negotiations fail because someone at a table could not tolerate silence for 40 minutes that I had come to treat the tolerance as a basic professional skill, not an accommodation. On the third morning, after 40 minutes, Seith said, "The tariff exemption on page 17. Does it apply to goods in transit or only to goods terminating at a compact port of entry?" It was a good question. It was a considerably better question than any of the compact legal team had asked about that section during the drafting review, and the answer was not immediately clear from the text as written. I said so honestly, told her I would check the original drafting notes from the legal office, and came back with the answer that afternoon. The exemption applied to goods terminating at a compact port of entry only, a narrower reading than the text implied on a surface reading, and narrower than the SciFi delegation had apparently been operating under. It had implications for 3 of the 9 categories listed in Schedule B, all of which would need to be re-examined before the accord terms could be finalized. I gave her the full technical answer, including the Schedule B implications. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded once, a compact, precise nod, the kind that means I have the information and have filed it rather than I agree with it, and went back to watching the room. After that, she was in the Commons every morning. She rarely spoke more than a few sentences in a session, but the sentences were always specific, and they were always about something that mattered. On the 4th morning, she asked about the inspection protocol in Appendix 2, and whether the timing requirements were compact standard or VELSATH operational time. On the 5th morning, she identified, in the middle of what I thought was a routine logistics question from VETH, that the transit corridor mapped in Schedule C ran through a waypoint that had been decommissioned 2 years ago and was no longer operational as a refueling stop. Both of these required correction. Both had been missed by everyone else who had reviewed the document. On the 4th day, my supervisor called. Edar, his name was Lorne Vaseth. He was a capable administrator and a cautious man, and his caution had been shaped by 11 days of working around a situation he had correctly identified as difficult and incorrectly handled by doing nothing. He was not a bad man, and this is important. Bad men are actually easier to work around because their failures are predictable and come from a consistent place. Vaseth's failure was more common and more human. He had read the safety assessment, absorbed the briefing document, and formed a version of the situation from those materials rather than from the situation itself. The version he had formed was alarming. The situation, as I had been finding for 4 days, was not. I have received queries from 3 other delegations at this station, asking why a compact representative has been conducting daily in-person sessions with the VELSATHI delegation in Wing C. Because the VELSATHI Accord requires in-person representation, I said. That's on page 7 of the Accord terms. The VELSATHI senior emissary stated the requirement on day 3 of the previous representative's posting. The protocol was screens and audio contact. The protocol was 11 days of screens and audio contact with no movement on any of the Accord terms, I said. The VELSATHI Accord requires in-person representation, Lorne. It has required it since the document was drafted. Every day spent conducting screen contact was a day spent not doing what the Accord requires. A pause on the line. Edar, the safety assessment for direct enclosed space contact with VELSATHI females, is based on documented encounters where both parties were in an adversarial posture, I said. I am not in an adversarial posture. They are not treating me as though I am. We are having productive conversations about tariff schedules, transit exemptions, decommissioned waypoints in Schedule C, and the secondary steep variant in the ground seed concentrate dispenser. I have a working draft of the corrected Accord terms ready for review. Corrected, Vaseth repeated. There are at least 4 notation discrepancies between the drafted accord and current boundary survey data. None of them change the accord's intent, but they need to be corrected before signature, or the document will not accurately reflect current territorial conditions. The SciFi delegation identified the first one. I verified all 4 against compact outer survey records this morning and the previous afternoon. I paused. The corrections are documented and sourced. The session is moving forward. A longer pause. I could hear Vasith working through what he wanted to say next, whether there was anything useful to say that would also be accurate. "Be careful," he said finally. He said it the way people say things they feel obligated to say when they have run out of things that would actually change the situation. "I'll be careful," I said. I went back to Wing C. The 5th morning, Keithra and I went through the accord terms section by section. Not the 43-page summary, the actual treaty document, the one the compact legal office had produced, which was simultaneously thorough in the areas it understood and quite wrong about several things it had assumed without checking. Keithra caught the first discrepancy on page 12. A passage about shipping lane access that referenced a SciFi territorial designation from a boundary treaty superseded 14 years ago. "This is the old boundary notation," she said. Her finger touched the specific line. "The current designation was revised in the SciFi Compact Outer Survey Agreement 14 years ago. The revision was filed with the Compact Outer Survey Office rather than the Diplomatic Registry." "That's a bureaucratic gap," I said. "2 offices, 1 revision, the filing went to one and not the other." 14 years is a long gap." "Yes," I made a note. "Do you have the current survey?" She did. She had the entire current survey in the delegation's documentation files, presumably because she had anticipated exactly this problem and prepared accordingly. She walked me through the relevant sections with the same flat, methodical precision she brought to everything, not demonstrating, just moving through information at whatever speed I could follow, checking when I had it before proceeding. Veth sat beside her with her notation materials and cross-referenced as we went. We found 3 more discrepancies over the following 2 hours. None were malicious. They were the accumulation of time and bureaucratic distance, documents drafted by people who had read about a situation rather than lived or worked in it. Keithra identified each one the same way she identified the first. "Here is what the document says, here is what the current situation is, here is the gap between the two." Direct. No editorializing. No suggestion that the errors reflected bad faith on the compact's part. Just, "This is wrong, here is what is right, here is the documentation." By the end of the afternoon, we had a fully annotated corrected draft with all 4 discrepancies addressed, each correction cross-referenced to its source documentation. "I'll need to review this with Veth and Seath before the session," Keithra said. "Of course, take whatever time you need. The review session is day after tomorrow." She looked at the document on the table between us. A long look, not quite the instrument panel look, something slightly different, more personal than that. "Why did you come here?" she said. The phrasing was not quite a question. I thought about it as precisely as I could. "Because you'd been in this wing for 11 days and no one had knocked on the door," I said. "And because I've been doing this long enough to know that a negotiation doesn't fail because the terms are incompatible. It fails because the people on opposite sides stop being able to imagine that the person across the table is a person." She was quiet. The luminous ring in her eyes shifted in the way I had been noticing since the first morning. That quality change, not brightness, something harder to name. "We were told," she said, "that your species finds our females alarming, instinctive responses. Autonomic threat assessment triggers that your species cannot fully override." "Some of us have that response," I said. "I noticed it in myself the first morning, brief, in the corridor before I knocked. And after I was in the room it mostly resolved. The response is anticipatory mostly. The reality of sitting across from someone having a straightforward conversation about tariff schedules doesn't sustain the alarm the way the anticipation of doing it does. She considered this. Most beings do not distinguish between the anticipation and the reality, she said. They treat the anticipation as sufficient information. Most beings, I said, haven't spent 20 years watching that particular mistake cost them things they could have had. She looked at me with those still eyes for a long moment. You noticed we were alone, she said. Yes. Most species only notice the other thing about us, the thing that makes them keep distance. They notice that first, and they notice it as the most important thing, and then everything else they observe goes through that filter. A pause. You sat down. You were alone in a corridor for 11 days, I said. That seemed more important than the filter. The ring in her eyes shifted again, and this time it held, rather than returning to its neutral state. I still didn't have a name for what the shift meant, but it stayed. On the 5th morning, I came in to find Seath standing at the viewport window with her hands at her sides, and her attention focused on something in the docking ring below. I brought my cups to the table. Veth was already seated with her notation materials. Keithra came from the interior corridor a moment later. The freight carrier on arm 7, Seath said, without turning from the window. It has been at that arm for 3 days. The docking schedule shows it should have departed yesterday morning. Mechanical delay, I said. The main drive assembly is being serviced. They expect departure tomorrow. Seath turned from the window. She looked at me with the same full-body attention she brought to everything. Not the instrument panel red that Keithra used, something slightly different, more like the way a very still person watches a room and catalogs it against the version of the room they had built the last time they were in it. How do you know? She said. I asked the docking coordinator when I came through the main hub this morning. I saw the ship was still on arm 7 and I was curious. Seath looked at me for a moment. Then she came to the table and sat down. On the 6th morning, the morning of the Accord review session, I brought the cups as usual and found all 3 of them already in the commons. Veth was at the table with the corrected draft, making final notation checks. Keithra was standing near the interior doorway, not reading anything, just present. Seath was at the window again, watching the docking ring. The freight carrier departed, she said as I came in. This morning at 5:30, I said. I heard the departure from the resident level. She made a small sound, not quite a word, something between acknowledgement and satisfaction. She turned from the window and sat down. Keithra came to the table. Veth looked up from her notation materials and handed me a folded notation card. She had summarized the 4 correction points in her own system so that I would have a reference during the session. I looked at it. The marks were unfamiliar, but the structure was clear enough to read. Thank you, I said. It will be more useful than nothing, Veth said, which was, I had learned, her way of saying you're welcome. The Accord review session was held in the way station's formal signing chamber on the 6th floor. A large, carefully neutral room, long oval table, uncomfortable chairs, a viewing gallery set into the wall above where observers from other delegations and the station's administrative staff could watch without being in the proceedings. There were 14 delegations represented at Threshketh 11. By the time the session opened, I estimated the gallery held representatives from at least 11 of them, along with a cluster of way station staff who had found administrative reasons to be on the 6th floor. The compact delegation filed in from the corridor connection to the administrative wing. Vaseth was there, with 3 members of the legal office and 2 senior trade representatives. He gave me a look when he came in, the look of a man who has received 3 interagency queries about your conduct and has not yet decided how to feel about any of it. The Velsathi delegation entered from the Wing C corridor connection. The chamber did what rooms do when Velsathi females walk into them. A collective stillness, below the level of conscious decision-making. Posture shifted across the table. Eyes tracked and then were carefully directed elsewhere. Vasith's legal team performed a small, coordinated movement away from the entrance end of the table, so gradual and automatic that I doubt any of them noticed doing it. Keithra noticed. She always noticed. Her expression did not change. She took the Velsathi delegation's designated position at the table and set her documentation folder down with the same flat, methodical care she brought to every physical action. Veth sat to her left with her notation materials in front of her. Seath sat to her right and looked at the room the way she looked at every room she entered, cataloging it against the version she had built from the doorway. Vasith opened with the standard compact greeting protocol. 4 minutes correctly delivered. Keithra listened without moving. Veth's notation tool moved steadily. When the greeting concluded, Vasith gestured to the document before him and said that the compact was prepared to proceed with the signing on the terms as drafted. Keithra said, without particular emphasis, that the Velsathi delegation had reviewed the draft accord and found several notations requiring correction before signature could proceed. The legal team's reaction was what I had expected, a particular variety of alarmed silence, the kind produced by people who believe that additional corrections mean additional months of drafting and internal review. I caught the eye of Sela, one of the trade representatives, who had the expression of someone watching a familiar and preventable disaster arrive on schedule. "We have prepared a corrected draft," Keithra said. She produced it, identical to the version she and I had worked through, but now annotated in Velsathi notation as well as compact standard throughout. Liaison Edar has reviewed the corrections with us. He can speak to the specific discrepancies if the compact legal team requires clarification on any point. Every head at the table turned toward me. Vasith's expression moved through several phases: surprise, calculation, the particular look of a man deciding whether to be annoyed or grateful and settling, after a moment, on something in between. "Liaison Edar," he said, "you reviewed the draft with the delegation." "Yes," I said. "Over the last 2 days. There were 4 discrepancies between the drafted terms and current compact outer survey boundary data. All 4 are documented and corrected in the version before you. None of them change the Accord's fundamental intent. They're precision corrections to ensure the document reflects current conditions rather than superseded survey records from 14 years ago." The legal team had the corrected draft by now. They were reading it. Dale Vorath, the senior legal representative, was a thorough man and a careful one, and his expression as he read moved from routine resistance to something more carefully neutral. He flipped to Appendix 4, read the survey reference. His mouth tightened slightly in the way that people's mouths tighten when they realize they have been working from an incomplete file. "The boundary notation on page 12, he said. "This is the current survey designation." "Yes," Keithra said. "The revision was filed 14 years ago with the compact outer survey office. It was not cross-filed to the diplomatic registry." "That's a filing gap on our end," Vorath said, with the careful fairness of a person who does not enjoy admitting institutional failures but respects accuracy enough to do it. He looked at the rest of the team. "We need to verify the other 3. "The documentation for all 4 is in Appendix 4, Keithra said. "Reference numbers and filing dates are included for each." Vorath flipped to Appendix 4. The team spread the corrected draft between them. The session moved into the kind of detailed back and forth that treaty review sessions are supposed to involve: specific questions, specific answers, specific documentation checked against specific claims. Keithra answered everything directly. Veth provided supplementary data from her notation materials when asked, which was frequently. Seath did not speak, but she watched the legal team as they worked through the appendix with an attention so steady that at least two of them became visibly aware of it and made small, unconscious adjustments to their posture. After 2 hours, the corrected accord was before both parties for signature. Vasith was preparing to proceed when Keithra placed her hands flat on the table. "Before signature," she said, "the Velsathi Accord requires the compact to designate a primary liaison to the resulting agreement. Under Velsathi Accord protocol, the designation is subject to confirmation by the Velsathi delegation." Vasith stopped. He looked at Voreth. Voreth was already looking at the treaty document at page 31, I knew, where that requirement had been sitting since the document was drafted, and where it had apparently not been flagged in any of the summaries. "The primary liaison," Keithra continued, with her hands still flat on the table in the formal gesture, "will serve as the principal compact contact for all accord implementation and calibration matters for the duration of the agreement. Velsathi protocol requires that this individual have demonstrated good faith in direct representation to the delegation, not through formal procedure, but through conduct." The chamber was very quiet. I heard the gallery above shift. "The Velsathi delegation," Keithra said, "designates Solon Edar as primary liaison to the Threshketh Accord." The room turned toward me. All of it, the legal team, the trade representatives, Vasith, the gallery above, the full weight of a chamber full of people recalibrating a situation. Voreth said, with the careful formality of someone who knows the text, "Is this designation confirmed by the Velsathi delegation in full?" "Confirmed," said Keithra. "Confirmed," said Veth, without looking up from her notation materials, as though this were a routine administrative filing rather than something the entire gallery was watching. Seath had been watching the table. She raised her eyes and looked at me. That full-body attention, whatever she had been cataloging since the first morning, was complete now, or close to it. She had the expression of someone who has verified a conclusion against the available data and found the data sufficient. "Confirmed," she said, not formally, not loudly, precisely. I accepted the designation. The accord was signed 20 minutes later. Both parties, all 4 corrections incorporated, the boundary survey documentation correctly referenced throughout. Voreth handled the technical verification with the thoroughness he brought to everything. Vasith signed on behalf of the compact. Keithra signed on behalf of the Velsathi delegation. The witnesses signed. The session was formally closed. In the gallery, I could see movement, delegations, and station staff talking to each other. Some in the urgent undertone of people who have just watched something happen and are working out what it means for them specifically. The delegations filed out through their respective corridor connections. Vasith stopped beside me at the door. "Edar," he said. "I know," I said. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who is still doing the arithmetic on a situation he did not expect. "The 3 delegations who sent queries about your conduct in Wing C," he said. 2 of them have submitted follow-up queries in the last 20 minutes asking whether similar liaison arrangements with the Velsath might be available through the Accord framework." I nodded. "I'll request your permanent assignment to Threshketh 11, he said. "You'll need resident-level quarters." "Thank you." He made a sound, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. 43 pages, he said. "1 corridor," I said. He shook his head in the particular way of a man deciding to be glad about something he did not engineer. Then he went back toward the administrative wing, and I went back down the restricted corridor. It felt different walking it now. Not because anything had changed in the corridor, same gray walls, same secondary air circulation unit running its steady hum, same slight unevenness in the deck plate at the junction turn that you learned to step over without thinking. The difference was inside the walk. A thing you do once as a decision becomes, by the 6th time, simply the way you move through a space. I pressed the door panel with my palm. The door opened. Keithra was at the viewport window. The one Seath stood at every morning to watch the docking ring. She was watching it now, or perhaps just present near it, which with Velsathi females is sometimes the same thing. The secondary docking ring moved through its rotation. The arm that had held the delayed freight carrier now empty, the whole mechanism doing its patient scheduled work. 2 cups were on the table, standard steep both of them. I sat down. The gallery was full, she said without turning. Yes. Several of the observers had not seen the Velsathi delegation in the same room as compact representatives before. We were told there were recording devices in the gallery. Probably, session recordings are standard protocol. They will be reviewed. She turned from the window. She moved to the table with that same unhurried certainty, the certainty of someone who has never had to deliberate about whether to take up the space their body requires. She sat across from me. She picked up her cup with both palms. Your administrator was surprised. He knew I had been coming to Wing C. He was surprised that the designation happened the way it did. I picked up my own cup. He'll adjust. He approved of you. He approved of the outcome, I said. That's close enough to start with. She held the cup and looked at the table for a moment, not reading anything on it, just looking in the way of someone letting a thought settle before they speak it. Why did they not come, she said. The previous representatives, 11 days, why did none of them walk down this corridor? I had thought about how to answer this honestly since the first morning. Fear, I said, and then the decision to let fear be sufficient reason not to act. Fear itself is involuntary, you feel it, you register it, you do not choose it. That part is not a failure. The part that becomes a failure is when the fear gets converted into policy. When it becomes, I feel alarmed, therefore contact is logistically challenging, therefore I will send another memo. The fear doesn't go anywhere. It just becomes administrative. She was quiet. You were alone, I said. That was the clearest fact. 11 days and no one had knocked on your door. That seemed like the thing that needed addressing. Most beings, Keithra said, do not notice that about us. They notice only the other thing, the size, the history, the assessments in the briefing documents that describe what our females are capable of. She set her cup down. They read that and they build a version of us from the reading, and then they respond to the version rather than to us. Yes, I said. You came in and sat down. You were in the room, I said. That seemed more important than the version. The ring in her eyes was doing the thing I had been watching for 6 days and 6 afternoons, that quality shift, that change in what the light did when it caught the iris. Holding now, not cycling. I had a name for it, I realized. Not the technical Velsathi name, just the one I had assembled from watching it across 6 mornings. It was the look of someone who has been navigating by an instrument that has been consistently telling the truth, and who has decided to trust the instrument. In Velsathi, Keithra said carefully, there is a word for a person who approaches when every other being in the station has made a different calculation. I will not translate it directly. The direct translation loses the specific weight of it in our language. What does it mean, roughly? She considered. Roughly, she looked at her cup. It means the one who saw the thing that was actually there instead of the thing that was expected to be there. A pause. In our language, the word is also used for a navigator who reads what the instruments show rather than what they assume the instruments would show. The two meanings are not accidental. I sat with that for a moment. It is not a small word, she said. No, I said, neither is the thing it describes. She looked at me. The ring in her eyes held. Outside, the docking ring completed another rotation, the empty arm moving past the viewport window, the space where the delayed carrier had been for 3 days now clean and ready for the next arrival. We stayed until the cups were empty. When I finally stood to go, Keithra walked me to the door, which she had not done on any of the previous 6 mornings. "Liaison Edar," she said at the door. "Solon," I said. She held the word for a moment, the way you hold a precise thing when you are deciding whether the precision is right. "Solon," she said. I went back through the corridor, through the main way station hub, past the lift banks and the administrative wing and the secondary commons, where 2 of the other delegation's representatives were talking in the specific undertone of people who have not quite processed what they watched in the gallery, and are not yet ready to acknowledge that they find it instructive. Vaseth was at the entrance to the administrative corridor. He was waiting with the expression of a man who has completed his arithmetic. "The Accord office has confirmed your designation," he said. "Implementation schedule is attached. Monthly calibration contact minimum for the first year, more during the boundary survey period." He paused. 3 additional delegations have submitted requests this afternoon asking about the Vel-Sath liaison framework. One of them specifically asked whether the same liaison approach could be used for the Vel-Kareth border accord, which has been in draft for 6 years. I looked at him. "I told them the primary requirement is that someone walk down a corridor," he said. "I thought that was approximately accurate." "It's accurate," I said. He nodded. He went back to his office. I went to find the resident level and request quarters. The next morning I was back in Wing C at 7. All 3 of them were already in the commons. Veth had her notation materials out. Seath was at the window, watching the docking ring's morning cycle. Keithra was near the small kitchen area. As I came through the door, she handed me a cup. Standard steep, already at the right temperature. I sat down. Seath turned from the window and came to the table. Veth looked up from her notation materials, made a mark and looked back down. "The calibration survey," Keithra said, sitting across from me. "The first session will need to address the boundary designation at the eastern approach. The current charts use the old notation throughout." "I know," I said. "I pulled the current survey this morning. We'll need about 3 sessions to work through the eastern approach properly." Veth made another mark in her notation materials. Seath watched the table. Keithra held her cup with both palms. "3 sessions is sufficient," Keithra said. Outside, the docking ring ran its rotation. A new carrier was approaching Arm 7. The approach path brought it across the viewport window for a moment, a long dark shape against the stars. And then the arm locked and the carrier settled, and the ring continued its patient scheduled work, the same as it had done every morning for 40 years, waiting for the things that needed to be moved to arrive, and the things that needed to move on to depart. I have been back to Threshketh 11 times since. The monthly calibration sessions became quarterly once the boundary survey was complete, and the corrected charts were filed with both the Compact Outer Survey Office and the Vel-Sath Accord Registry. Veth and Seath moved to their next postings after the first year. 2 other members of the Vel-Sath Accord Office took their places. I learned both their names on my first visit after the rotation, brought 2 cups on the first morning, and sat down. That, as far as I could tell, was the entire procedure. Keithra remained as senior emissary. In Vel-Sath diplomatic structure, a senior emissary stays with an active accord for its full term unless there is a formal request for reassignment. There is a formal process for it. It requires a written statement of reasons, filed with the Vel-Sath Accord Registry and the primary liaison simultaneously. She has not filed one. I do not expect her to. I asked her once, in the second year, what the word was. The Vel-Sath word she had described, the one that meant the one who saw the thing that was actually there instead of the thing that was expected to be there. The navigator's word. She told me. I cannot reproduce the sound of it accurately in this account, because it is not a sound that the human vocal apparatus produces cleanly. But she told me the word, and she told me that in Vel-Sath the word has a secondary usage. not in diplomatic or navigational contexts, but in a more personal one. The secondary usage refers to someone whose presence causes you to see yourself more accurately than you did before, not because they tell you who you are, because they pay attention to what is actually there. She said the two usages are not accidental. That in SciFi thinking, the capacity to see a thing clearly and the capacity to be seen clearly are understood as connected. That a person who genuinely looks tends, over time, to be genuinely looked at in return. I said I thought that was probably true across most species. She said she had also come to think so. 14 other delegations have now opened direct contact sessions with SciFi females following the Threshketh model. 7 produced substantive progress on agreements that had been stalled for years. 4 produced new arrangements in adjacent areas that no one had expected to move. 2 resolved boundary calibrations that had been unresolved for over a decade. 1 produced an accord that 3 separate drafting committees had formally concluded was not achievable. None of those sessions were arranged through screens and intercoms. All of them began when someone decided to walk down a corridor and knock on a door. That is, I have come to believe, almost always the whole of it. The fear does not have to go away first. The alarm does not have to resolve before you move. You simply make the choice that the thing that is actually there matters more than the version you have built from the briefing documents, and you go toward it, and you sit down. The cup is waiting.